I think must be able to accompany all my representations, for otherwise something would be represented in me that could not be thought at all, which is as much as to say that the representation would either be impossible, or else at least would be nothing for me. That representation that can be given prior to all thinking is called intuition. Thus, all manifold of intuition has a necessary relation to the I think in the same subject in which this manifold is to be encountered. But this representation is an act of spontaneity. It cannot be regarded as belonging to sensibility. Immanuel Kant. As I explained previously, according to Kant, our faculty of cognition has two parts. The lower faculty of cognition, that is sensuality, is receptive. It is passive. It lets us view the things as they affect us, as they are given to us. While the higher faculty of cognition, that is intellectuality, is spontaneous or self-active. It is the faculty through which we think. And in my last lecture, I talked about the lower faculty of cognition. I talked about sensuality. And I explained that what it gives us are perceptions. Perceptions, I said, are made up of a material, that is various sensations, the colors, the smells, the tastes, and so on, which is subjective. And this subjective material also has a form. That is the two forms of viewing or of intuition, space and time, which come from us, which are the forms in which we view things, but exactly for that reason are objective. If by the object we understand not the object as a thing in itself, but the object that appears to us. That objectively is a spatial and temporal object because it can only appear in space and time. However, to be strictly speaking, only the higher faculty of cognition could really be called the faculty of cognition. Because according to Kant, actual cognition only can be arrived at through thinking. Because what cognition is to him is, it is an objective representation. Perceptions, however, perceptions are subjective representations. That means that when I perceive something, I have this representation in my mind. But that's just subjective. That's just in me, in the subject. It could be real. I could be perceiving a real thing. Or maybe I'm dreaming and I'm perceiving something just in my dream. As a perception, it makes no difference. A perception as such is neither true nor false because it is a subjective representation. It only becomes a cognition, according to Kant, through a judgment of our intellect, of our thinking. So when I judge this thing that I'm perceiving is not just in my mind, but I'm perceiving a real thing, when I make that judgment, and of course when that judgment is correct, only then does the perception become a cognition. So that is what Kant means. In today's everyday language, subjective and objective are usually used to mean, subjective is used to mean what is basically just my private opinion, and objective is understood to mean what is true. But in the correct philosophical language, that's not what they mean. What they mean is subjective is what's in the subject, and objective is what's in the object. And only when a perception, so when a representation is related to an object, only when we correctly judge that it represents an object, only then does it become a cognition. Of course, such judgments can also be wrong. I talked about this in my lecture on Kant's critical method, where I discussed how error is even possible. And there I explained that according to Kant, our sensuality can never be wrong. It can also never be right, because it doesn't make any judgments. A perception is just that. I just perceive that thing. I have these sensations and they happen in space and time. That can never be wrong. Only the intellect, which judges whether this is just in me or whether this is actually related to an object, only this intellect can be right or wrong. Now, this intellect, this higher faculty of cognition, was defined by Kant as self-active, spontaneous. So we now have to ask, in what way is it active? And here, the crucial point on which Kant's whole critical philosophy basically hinges is that he says what it actively produces is never material. So we can't, through mere thinking, through our intellect, we can't come up with new material truths, with new material representations. Rather, what we do actively produce with our thinking is form. So to Kant, what the intellect is doing is reflection. The intellect reflects about the sensual data, so to say, and gives them a form. But it always needs this sensual material to work with. So what Kant is saying is that cognition always has two parts. The one part, the sensual part, is the material of the cognition, its content, so to say, and that is the perception. So to be clear, in the last lecture I said that perceptions themselves have a material and a form. I said their material is the sensations and the form is time and space as our form of viewing. But now, if we take the perception as a whole, with its material and with its form, then as a whole, it again is the material. It is the content of our cognitions. And the other side is the intellectual reflection of this material, which is the form of our cognitions. And only by perception and reflection coming together, so only when we have a content and a form combined, only then can we have a cognition. But what does it mean to give something a form? It means bringing some sort of unity into it, right? The form sort of combines and brings together a multitude. And This unity, however, is not one that is just there and just exists, because then it wouldn't come from our intellect, then it wouldn't be something that we actively think and create, but rather then it would be something that is affecting us, that is passively viewed. Then it would be part of the perception and therefore part of sensuality. We can think of God's intellect. I talked about that in the 2 lectures ago, in the lecture on how synthetic judgments a priori are possible. We can think of God's intellect as viewing things. We can think of God as having an intellectual viewing, Kant says, and in that case, in God's intellect, the unity of things would not be something given to them, something formed, something brought into multiplicity. It would be there from the beginning, and God would view the things as being a unity right away. But in our case, this unity has to be created first by the intellect. And this creation of unity, this bringing together, is called synthesis. That is why Kant says our intellect or our thinking faculty, what it really does is creating a synthetic unity of the manifold. That is what giving a form really means, right? Synthesizing things into one unity. And that is all that thinking really does, according to Kant. Our thinking, in the broadest and the most general sense, is always an act of connecting, of bringing together, of composing things, of bringing them into a form, synthesizing them into a unity. That, once again, is the active part. What we can't do is, so to say, create new things, create new representations. We get new representations only passively, only through our sensuality as we receive them. But we can bring them into a form. And that is our thinking. And of course, I previously talked about synthetic and analytic judgments. But even the analytic judgments, Kant would say they are secondary. The synthetic judgments have the primacy because an analysis can only bring out what has previously been synthesized. So I used examples for analytic judgments. I said saying that a father is male and has at least one child, or saying that a bachelor is unmarried, that is analytic. But how can we do this analysis? Where do we even get the concept of a father or of a bachelor from? Only through a previous synthesis. At some point in my life, I synthesized the concept of maleness and the concept of parenthood, and came to understood that that makes a father. And now I can analyze this previously synthesized concept. I can try to take it apart again to become more clear about which parts I synthesized, which parts I put into this concept. But originally, there must have been a synthesis, or else I couldn't analyze anything. Unless you wanted to claim that certain concepts just lie in our head, like they were given to us by God or whatever, and we just have them from birth. Then we could maybe analyze them without having previously synthesized them. But if you don't want to make that claim, and Kant certainly doesn't want to make that claim that we are just magically born with certain concepts, then you must assume that every analysis is preceded by some sort of synthesis. So that, once again, that is what thinking does. It synthesizes. You must realize that in our experience, every single element, without exception, is sensual. So the colors, the smells, the tastes, the feelings, all the sensations, they are sensual. And also the form in space and in time, that is sensual, save for one element, and that one element in our experience which isn't sensual is the connection, the composition of things. Any sort of connection you ever find in the world, that is not sensual. That wasn't perceived or viewed by you, but rather that is something you think. That sounds like very little, but actually it is a lot, because a lot more things are connections than we realize, and a lot more things are thought and judged, not perceived and viewed, than we realize. People tend to often believe, because they don't reflect enough and aren't clear enough about their own experience, they often believe that they perceive connections. But if you think about it, you never perceive connections. Like, people would claim that they perceive leaves being connected to a tree. They perceive the leaves growing on the tree. But that's not true. You don't perceive that. If you just go by what you see when you look at the tree, you see that there's the branch, and then there's the leaf. And okay, you don't see a space between them. You see that they are right next to each other, but that doesn't mean that you actually see a connection between them. I mean, when you see a person leaning on the wall, they are not connected. I mean, they are connected in the way that they touch, but they are not attached to each other. So if in this second example, you don't see an attachment between the person and the wall, then in the first example, you don't see an attachment between the leaf and the branch either. You think it. You judge that in the second case, they are not glued to each other, they just happen to touch for a moment, while in the first case, they are actually connected to each other. That is your judgment. Or to go with the famous example of Hume, Hume looked at causality, and that is actually what started Kant down the path onto his own critical philosophy. So he would understand that what Hume discovered in the case of causality is not true just for causality, but for all forms of connections. But of course, causality is one form of connection, and Hume says when we see one billiard ball rolling against the second one, and we see the second ball rolling away, all that we see is those movements, is that the first one touched the second one, and then the second one started to move. But we don't see the connection. We don't see that the second one moves because of the first one. That is not a perception, because we can't perceive a because. We can only think a because. We ourselves make this connection. We, so to say, we put it into our perception, but we don't perceive it directly. Or one example of Kant's, when I carry a heavy object in my hand, I have two perceptions. I perceive the object that I see in my hand, and I feel the heaviness. I feel the weight in my hand. But I cannot perceive that they are connected. I cannot perceive that this object is heavy. I mean, all I can say is I have these different perceptions at the same time. I have the sensation of heaviness, and I have the sensations, the color sensations when I look at the object. But just because I have two different perceptions at the same time, that doesn't mean they are connected. I mean, I can put one hand into the fridge, and I could put another hand on the oven, and then I would perceive the coldness, and I would perceive the heat in my two hands. But that doesn't mean that they are connected. That doesn't mean that the cold fridge makes the oven be hot or whatever. So once again, the fact that the heaviness is connected with this object is not in my perception, it is in my judgment. In fact, the logical copula is, I talked about this in previous lectures, that in logic, this connecting middle word that connects the subject with its predicate is called the copula. So when I say the object is heavy, this is the copula, and this copula, Kant says, that is what our thinking adds to our cognition. We never perceive an is. An is always comes from us. An is always represents a judgment that we make. I judge that I don't just happen to perceive the object and happen to perceive heaviness at the same time, but rather I judge that the object is heavy. So that the heaviness is in the object. That comes from my thinking. And here I would also like to point you at another fact. When I want to imagine new things that I have not seen, products of fantasy, all I can create are forms. Because, once again, the forms, the connections, they come from my self-active faculty, they come from my thinking faculty. But all the content, all the material, comes from my passively receptive faculty of sensuality. So you cannot imagine new colors that you have never seen. You cannot imagine new tastes that you have never tasted. So the sensations, you have to work with those that you have. Or you cannot imagine new forms of viewing other than space and time. So all the things you imagine, no matter how fantastical, no matter how far removed from regular reality, all the things you imagine, you have to imagine as temporal, spatial, and as made up of sensations you know. The one thing that you can imagine without ever having perceived it is different connections between the things. So I have no problem imagining an orange mouse or a purple elephant. Even if you have never seen such things, you have seen the colors orange and purple, and you know space, and in space something can have the form of a mouse or of an elephant. So even if you hadn't ever seen these animals with these forms, you could still imagine new forms in space, of course. So you can imagine a connection between the color orange and the form of a mouse in space. And that should show you or prove to you that this connection, even when you do perceive an actual mouse, and it is connected not with the color orange, but with the color gray or white or black or brown, that should show you that even in that case, the connection is not actually perceived. Because, once again, if we perceived connections, we could not imagine new connections that we never perceived, just like we cannot imagine new sensations that we never sensed. But rather, the connection, even when you do think you are seeing it, is something that you made, that you judge there to be. Now, this higher faculty of cognition, this thinking faculty of ours, which in the most general possible description is a faculty of giving things a form, of connecting things, of creating a synthetic unity of the manifold. This thinking faculty, according to Kant, has three parts. That is the intellect, the power of judgment, and reason. There is some difficulty sometimes when reading Kant, because the thinking faculty as a whole by him is, for the most part, also called the intellect. So that means that he uses the word intellect in two different senses. There is the intellect in the narrow sense, which is one of our thinking faculties, along with the power of judgment and along with reason. And there's intellect in the broader sense, which is the thinking faculty in general, made up of reason, of the power of judgment, and of the intellect in the more narrow sense. And then also, there are other instances, fewer, but they also exist, where Kant refers to the whole faculty of thinking as reason. So that would mean that you have reason in the broader sense, which is made up of the intellect in the narrow sense, the power of judgment, and reason in the narrower sense. And the most prominent example for this is, of course, the title of the Critique of Pure Reason. Because the Critique of Pure Reason is not just criticizing reason in the narrow sense, it also deals with the intellect and with the power of judgment. So here the word reason must be understood in the broader sense as referring to the whole faculty of thinking. So that makes reading Kant a little difficult at times, because when you read the word intellect, or also sometimes when you read the word reason, you have to ask in what way does Kant mean it. So, for example, his famous description of Aufklärung, where he says that Aufklärung is the exit of man of his self-imposed or self-caused non-age, and he defines this non-age as the inability to use one's own intellect by oneself without the guidance of another. You can, of course, just read that and think your part, because intellect is a word that we use in our general everyday speech, and everyone thinks something when hearing that word and believes to know what intellect means. But if you want to go deeper and interpret that passage more correctly, then you have to ask, which intellect is Kant referring to here? Is Aufklärung just about using your intellect in the narrow sense for yourself and not your power of judgment or your reason? Or is Aufklärung about using all three of those faculties for yourself? So does Kant mean the intellect in the broader sense here? And of course, in this case, the latter is true. I will talk more about this sometime in the future when I get to Kant's concept of Aufklärung. But here this was just meant as an example. To avoid these difficulties and these misunderstandings, I think it's best to use for the whole to use a third term that Kant sometimes uses, and that is the faculty of thinking. He uses this name less frequently than the name intellect or even the name reason in the broader sense. But since it is the one name that cannot be misunderstood, I will from now on, in this lecture and in future lectures, I will from now on use this name, faculty of thinking, while reserving the names of intellect and reason for just their more narrow usage. Here in this lecture, and also in the next couple of lectures, I first want to talk about the intellect in the narrow sense. And if the thinking faculty as a whole is our faculty of making connections and creating a synthetic unity of the manifold, then the intellect is the faculty through which we connect the data we get from our senses. And the intellect is that faculty which brings synthetic unity into sensuality. So while our viewing gives us always something singular and specific, the intellect thinks to these singular things the general rule. So, for example, I may view a singular animal, a singular dog or whatever, and the intellect comes up with the concept of dog and makes a connection between many singular animals that I encountered by judging that they were all dogs and had all had certain attributes in common. And therefore, if we didn't have this intellect, but just had sensuality, we would still have sensations, and we would still perceive them in space and time, but there would be no connection between them. So there would just be a chaos of various colors and sounds and smells that we couldn't make any sense of. Only because the intellect forms connections and gives general rules to this, can there be any sort of understanding and cognition. Here Kant's whole theory proves to be very aufklärt, because Aufklärung is about no longer living as a victim. It is the unaufklärt who always thinks of himself as a victim, but rather realizing that we are perpetrators, that we are active and responsible. And here we have one example for this, because unaufklärt people, they tend to have this naive empiricism, where they believe that they just perceive the world, including the connections, and they hold many things to be data that actually are facts. Because if we take these words by their actual Latin meaning, then a datum is something that is given to me, but a factum is something that is made. Facere, after all, means to make, to create. So, yes, indeed, the things are facts, but not as the word fact is nowadays often understood, but rather in the literal sense. They are made by us insofar as we bring the connections in them. Because, as I explained when talking about transcendental idealism in a previous lecture, the thing in itself is not known by us. The thing in itself, Kant says, is just an unknown X. We know nothing about it except for the negative knowledge that it is not an appearance. Therefore, whatever connections there are in a thing, whatever unity there is in a thing, is not a connection, is not a unity that exists in the thing itself. Because even if that thing had some sort of unity, some sort of form, some connection of multitude, of the manifold, we could not know about it. Rather, the unity of the thing is synthesized by our intellect. And now Kant says that when it comes to the process of cognition, there are three steps, so to say, three acts of our intellect that are needed in order to have an experience. And these three steps are the intellect bringing synthetic unity into our own consciousness, or apperception. The intellect, through the power of imagination, bringing synthetic unity into the image that we perceive, or apprehension. And finally, the intellect, through its own concepts, its own rules, bringing synthetic unity into experience, or intellection. And here in this lecture, I want to stick with apperception and explain what apperception means before turning to the other two steps in the next lectures. We are not always conscious of the synthesizing of our intellect. We are not always conscious of the synthesizing of our intellect. We are only conscious of the unity that is created through that. So we are conscious of the result. And the first such synthetic unity that the intellect creates is that of the subject, of us, the thinking subject. Because only through the intellect does the subject come into being, Kant says. Or, well, maybe not. That's not the right way to express it, because that makes it sound like the intellect was there before and now the intellect would create the subject. Rather, this act of creating the subject, so to say, is not done by the intellect, it is itself the intellect, Kant would say. And the subject, the I, is the first act of thinking. And to be clear here, and that is very, very important, it is an act. It is not just something that is, just a fact. Now using the word fact in the usual way it's used again. But rather, it is an act. People may believe that there is an I, a self, and now that I is thinking, but rather Kant shows that it is the other way around. There is thinking, and that thinking thinks, so to say, of itself as being thought by an I. And this act of synthesizing the various representations as being the representations of one shared subject which thinks all of them, that act is what Kant calls apperception. That word, he didn't come up with it. That word was already in use in 18th century philosophical language. But his understanding of it is different from the understanding that previous philosophers had of it. In Kant's writing, when you read the word apperception, you can take it as more or less synonymous with the word self-consciousness or with the word I, the self. The difference being not so much in content, but in what aspect the focus is put on. Because if you say the self-consciousness or the I, it makes it sound like there's this thing, this substance that exists, the self-consciousness, the I, and now this thing is doing the thinking. While Kant wants to emphasize that self-consciousness, that the I is an act, the act of apperceiving. And only through this act, which is itself the act of thinking, only through this act does it come into being. Because our inner sense and what our inner sense perceives, the thoughts, the feelings, the desires, that is fleeting and ever changing. So that is a manifold. And I mean, what is saying that I am always the same person? How do I know that I, who now thinks this and that, am the same person as I was in my childhood when I thought other things, or when my feelings change, when maybe one moment I'm sad and then the sadness fades away and I become happy? Who is to say that I, who is happy now, am really the same person who previously was sad? Maybe my sad soul left my body and was replaced by a happy soul. Maybe that is the very explanation for the changing of feelings and the changing of thoughts. The thing is that I say that I am always the same. I make this connection in my thinking, and that is exactly what Kant calls apperception. This act of saying that my current thoughts, my current feelings, my current desires, and my past ones, they are all the thoughts and feelings and desires and so on of one and the same subject who thinks who feels, who desires these things. In my experience, this insight is one of the insights of transcendental idealism that people struggle with the most. One of the most famous statements in the history of philosophy is also the one that maybe seems to be the most self-evident. And that is the statement of Descartes, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. It seems very self-evident, so much so that even skepticism apparently can't doubt it, that I exist. The whole world that I perceive may be just a dream. I may be trapped in a matrix or whatever, but at least I must exist, because as Descartes says, if I doubt things, like if I try to doubt my own existence, that doubting is a form of thinking. And who is doing that doubting? Who is doing that thinking? It is me, the subject. The object that is thought may be wrong, but there must always be a thinking subject. That seems to be self-evident. However, Kant shows that this conclusion, insofar as it is supposed to be a conclusion, we could argue about whether it's meant as a conclusion in Descartes, but at least it is usually understood that way by those who came after Descartes. It is certainly treated as a conclusion in someone like Wolff, to whom Kant is responding. And Kant can show that if we take this as a conclusion, it is a wrong conclusion. We think that we can sort of go back from an expression of a force, of a power, to the thing from which this power comes from. So like we can go back from seeing the magnetic power moving, pulling a piece of metal, and from there can conclude that there is a magnet. We think that we can go back from thinking, from the thoughts, and go back to a substance like the magnet that is doing the thinking. An I, a self-consciousness that is thinking. However, Kant would say, in logic, when you do a conclusion, you must start from a premise, and this premise cannot already include what you want to conclude at the end, because then you would just be making a circle. Like you can say, to go with the famous example, you can say all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. But you cannot start from Socrates' mortality if that's what you want to prove. So you cannot say Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. I mean, you can say that and it's a correct statement, but it's tautological. It's not really proving anything. And now if we consider this statement cogito, the O ending in Latin denotes I think, therefore I am. Well, yes, that is a true statement. If I am the one who is thinking, then of course I must exist. No doubt about that. But the question was, do I exist? So I can't just assume that I am doing the thinking, because if I don't exist, then I'm certainly not doing any thinking. Actually, Kant says, we may think that we can do a synthetic judgment here, one that expands our knowledge. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. But actually, we can only make an analytic judgment, one that only explains what we already know. So instead of saying cogito ergo sum, Descartes, according to Kant, should have just said sum cogitans. I am thinking, because that is how I find myself. I find myself as a thinking being. And of course, I cannot find myself otherwise. I cannot conceive of myself in another way. If I stopped thinking, I would stop existing for myself. Maybe I could still exist for others, like a stone exists for others, but I would not know of my own existence. To think and to be self-conscious is really one and the same. But that does not mean that the I is thinking and is existing previously to the thinking, and the thinking comes out of the I, so to say. But rather, the I, in a way, comes out of the thinking. Kant says, instead of saying I think, we could also say he thinks or it thinks. And it not in the sense of a subject, a person, just an unspecific person doing the thinking, but rather just as a grammatical subject, like we say, it is raining. Without by this it meaning a specific thing that is doing the raining. Nothing is doing the raining. The rain is doing the raining, and the rain itself is nothing else but this act of doing the raining. Or to use an example of Nietzsche, the lightning. When we say a lightning flashes or a lightning strikes, it sounds like there's this substance, this being that is called a lightning, and this being is doing the flashing and the striking. But if you think about it, there is no such thing as a lightning. There is only this flashing, this act of flashing and striking, and we call that a lightning. So we think up this substance that is, so to say, beneath the flashing, and that is doing the flashing. But actually there is no such thing. And it is similar with the I. We are saying that I am thinking, but actually there's only the thinking, and there is no I independently of that thinking. But rather this thinking itself is the I. The thinking makes the I. So while Kant says we could also say he thinks or it thinks, Fichte more clearly says that even that is too much. It would be most correct to just say there appears the thought that I think, that I feel, that I desire, and so on. So the transcendental idealists would say that the I is not just, it doesn't just exist and then it thinks, but rather the I posits itself. The German word is Selbstsetzung, which means to put oneself somewhere, to sit oneself down somewhere. Fichte is famous for having said that. The expression is not really connected with Kant usually, but curiously enough, Kant himself, in his last writings that he didn't finish, his last unfinished work of his later years, he also uses the same expression. The I posits itself, or the thinking posits the I. The thinking says, I think, I am the one who thinks, and this very act is creating the I, so to say. But there is, of course, a good reason why most people don't see this, or even if told, struggle understanding this. And there's a good reason why the statement of Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, why it seems to be so self-evident. And that is that, of course, there can't be any self-consciousness without a self. That is in the very word. I am conscious of myself. But that, of course, doesn't prove the self independently of the thinking. It just proves that the thinking is not possible without thinking it as the thinking of a self. So, one famous statement of Kant is that I think, the statement I think, must be able to accompany all of my representations. So the important point is it must be able to. It's not necessarily actually accompanying all my representations. So of course, in everyday life, I don't always go, I think, this is my representation, I am the one perceiving this. But rather, usually, I, so to say, abstract from my I, and myself, so to say, is lost in the viewing of the objects. But Kant says, I must always be able to reflect on myself, even if I'm not always doing it. So any representation I have, any thought I have, but also any perception, any viewing I have, like when I see a dog or when I think of a triangle, I must always be able to say, I am the one seeing this dog. I am the one thinking of this triangle. And if I ever could not say that, if I ever could not recognize a representation as my representation, as belonging to me, and me being the subject who is representing that thing in its mind, then it would not be my representation, and I could not do anything with it. I could not learn from it. I could not connect it to my other representations. All experience, Kant says, depends on there being an I, a subject, and it depends on that subject always staying the same subject. Because an experience is not just a singular representation, but rather it is a connection between representations. And in order that two things can be connected with each other, they must be in the same medium, so to say, in which they will be connected. That is, two representations, in order to be connected, must be in the same I, in the same self. I mean, if one person perceives seeds being put on the ground, and then another person years later perceives a tree in that very place, neither of them has experienced that trees grow out of seeds. Only if the I who perceived the seed and the I who perceives the tree is the same person, only then can it make a connection between the two. Even such a simple experience as saying that swans are white. I mean, I can't say that from just perceiving one swan. I need to perceive several, and I need to always stay the same person. The swans they may change. I see one today, I see another one the next day. So the objects that are perceived, they are changing. But the subject who perceives them must remain the same through all those perceptions in order for it to be able to connect these perceptions and form an experience from them. Or it is as if there was a movie playing in a movie theater, and the movie is basically live. And now imagine that after every scene in the movie, a person would get up from his seat and go out of the room, and another person would go inside and take that seat. In the end, none of them would have seen the movie. None of them would be able to tell what happened in the movie, what the movie was about, because each of them would have perceived just one singular scene. The scenes may change, the movie will take its course, but the viewer who watches the movie must remain the same, or else the movie has not really been watched as one singular, one continuous movie. One example that Kant likes to give is saying that if you have a verse in poetry and you have several people who each memorize one word, then none of them knows the verse. In order for one person to know the verse, it really needs to be one person. There needs to be one subject which memorizes these several words. The synthetic unity of apperception now is nothing else but the unity of all the various representations we have, sort of, and thereby synthesized and united as belonging to one singular subject, as belonging to myself. Now, this act of apperceiving, of synthesizing all the various representations as belonging to me, as being my representations, this act of always saying, or at least being able to say, I think, I am the one thinking this. This is what apperception is. But now, what is important is that Kant differentiates between two different kinds of apperception. I already said that the word apperception existed before Kant in 18th century philosophy, but he criticizes the philosophers coming before him not really separating these two very different forms of apperception. And these two forms he calls, on the one hand, the empirical or psychological apperception, and this one relates to our inner sense. And I already said in the last lecture that through the inner sense, just like the outer sense, through the form of viewing that is space, perceives the objects, the bodies outside of us. Through the inner sense, we perceive our own representations, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, and they are of course ever changing, so they are a manifold, and through the impulse of the intellect, we do this empirical or psychological apperception and synthesize this manifold. We synthesize these specific representations as belonging to this specific I, that is our I. So what the empirical apperception gives us is the person That's what we usually mean when we call someone a person, when we talk about someone's personality or someone's character. The empirical or psychological apperception gives us that I, that self, which is the object of empirical psychology, as Kant would call it, or just psychology, as we nowadays would call it. And he criticizes the thinkers of his time for taking empirical psychology to be a part of metaphysics, for not separating it from rational psychology, which is not based on experience, on inner perception of our own feelings and emotions and thoughts, but which through pure reason tries to find out if the soul is immortal, how the soul is connected to the body, and so on. Kant insists that these two fields, dealing with two completely different selves and dealing with them through completely different modes, through empirical data and through pure rational thinking, that they must be separated. Well, the other form of apperception that Kant talks about is the one that is more important for us here, that we are concerned with here, that is called transcendental apperception, or also pure apperception, or also original apperception. And this one is the purely logical act of saying I. This one is the apperception that puts all the various representations together, that synthesizes all the representations as belonging to one subject. Here we are not saying anything else about that subject, because this is not about specific representations, specific thoughts, specific emotions, therefore belonging to a specific self with a specific character. This is just about, in general, all our representations, whatever they may be in content, belonging to one logical subject in which they are connected and which is thinking or representing all of them. Let me illustrate the difference between these two kinds of apperception by an example. When I put my hand on a hot stove plate and I feel the heat or even burn myself, I don't yet know that this stove plate is hot. I only know that when I touched it, I experienced heat. And that this subjective connection of two representations, I have the representation, or the more specifically the perception of touching the stove plate, and I have the perception of heat. Their connection is the empirical apperception. So I can say that in Jonathan Löwer's consciousness, the representation of the stoveplate and the representation of heat are connected with one another. But this sort of connection by itself can never be experienced. Even if I touch the stoveplate 100 times and burn myself 100 times, I can not say the stoveplate is hot. I can only say whenever I touched the stoveplate, I had the perception of heat. And Kant calls this subjective connection between representations, he calls it aggregation or association of representations. I can now say that in my specific mind, in the mind of this specific person, the representation of the stoveplate and that of the heat, they are associated with one another. They form an aggregate. But that's all I can say. And I mean, of course, there are instances where this subjective association does not mean that there's an objective connection. I mean, I can associate a certain song with a certain person, for example, for some reason, because of something that happened in the past, because I heard that song when meeting that person or whatever. That would mean that these two representations of that person and of that song are associated with one another subjectively in my mind, in my empirical apperception. But of course, they don't have an objective connection. I mean, that song is not the theme song of that person that plays whenever that person enters the room. Now, on the other hand, to go back to the first example, if I touch the stoveplate and feel the heat, and now I judge that the stoveplate is hot, that is the transcendental apperception, because now the connection between the stoveplate and the heat is no longer taken to be just subjective. I'm not saying they just happen to be associated with one another in my mind for whatever reason, but rather it is objective. That is to say, it is in the object. And that is what the logical copula of is, what it is saying. I previously said that this is always a judgment. It is always a connection that our intellect makes. And now I can be more specific and can say that according to Kant, the is, or are, or am, or whatever, the is always is an expression of the transcendental apperception. What I'm saying when I say the stoveplate is hot is the heat is connected to it not just in my mind but in the object itself. In other words, what I am saying is my mind cannot just connect them, or it doesn't just happen to connect these two representations, but rather what I'm saying is that they must be connected in my consciousness. I'm saying that it cannot be any other way. I mean, of course, in another time, the stoveplate maybe isn't hot if I turn it off and let some time pass. But in this specific situation, under these specific conditions, the stoveplate being turned on and so on, I am saying that I must connect these two things, the stoveplate and the heat. And not just me, I'm saying that any subject, any person who were to touch the stoveplate, again, if the conditions are the same, if the stove is still turned on and if the person has the same biology as me, so if it is a human being with heat receptors, but under the same conditions, I'm saying that any subject has to make that connection, because once again, it's not a subjective, it's an objective connection. And that is the transcendental apperception. Apperception in general means synthetic unity of the representations as belonging to one and the same subject, but transcendental apperception means that this synthetic unity is understood to be an objective unity. That is, the various representations must be connected in the same subject. And in their naive realism, most people, they don't ask what is the difference between reality and a dream. And the difference is not on the sensual side. It is not in the perceptions. I have perceptions of things that actually exist, and I have perceptions of things that are only in my dreams. Rather, it is on the side of the thinking faculty that there's a difference between dream and reality, Kant says. Because in my dreams, there may be a subjective connection still between things. I have my empirical apperception. The various things I dream, they are all dreamt by me, by the same person. But what is lacking in my dreams is that same objective connection between the things. In my dreams, I cannot really make an experience. I can only say I happen to have both these representations. They are associated in my mind, but I cannot say I must have both of them. When I in real life touch the hot stove plate, I must feel the heat. But in my dream, when shit happens, it can be that way. It could also be any other way. The dreams can get wild as they want. And if people's naive realism and naive empiricism was right, and if our experience was something that we just take in passively, then we could not really have experience, because what we take in passively are just the perceptions, but in them there never are connections. We don't perceive connections. So if our whole cognition just had this passive side, if we just, as empiricism claims, as Locke claimed, were an empty tablet and experience, so to say, write things down on this empty table, then we would never have any reason to take our perceptions to be more than simple dreams. And we would never have any reason to believe that our perceptions are perceptions of something, of an object outside of that perception, instead of just being images in our head. The transcendental apperception, so the objective synthetic unity of our representations, so us saying, I don't just think these things together, I have to think these things together, because they are not just associated in my mind, they actually are connected. That is a condition of the possibility of all experience. Whenever I say something is the case, this is what I mean. I am saying that things are not just connected in me, the subject, but rather that the connection is objective, that it is in the object. But now you have to remember what transcendental idealism teaches us. You have to remember that the objects that we deal with are not the things in themselves. And therefore this connection, which I say is in the object, not just in me, is not a connection that exists in the object itself, but rather the object I'm talking about is my appearance, and therefore the connection, which I say is not just in me but in the object, is a connection that I put in the object. Now that may sound paradoxical again, just like in the last lecture when I said that what comes from the object, the sensations we receive, is subjective, and what comes from the subject, the temporal and spatial form given to these sensations, the form in which these sensations appear, that is objective. That also sounded paradoxical. And so now it may sound paradoxical to say that the connections that the subject is forming and putting into the object, and that they aren't in the object itself, that these connections are objective. But what it means to say that two representations are connected, that this is the case objectively, what it means is nothing else but saying the subject cannot just sync them together if it chooses to, but rather the subject must sync them together. Therefore, it is objective, because syncing these representations together is a condition of even experiencing these objects. I can't experience the stovetop without experiencing the heat. I can't experience the swan without experiencing the whiteness. Therefore, it is objective, because this connection is a condition of the possibility of experience. It is a condition of the possibility of myself, of the I, because it is the transcendental apperception, putting these things, these representations together, connecting them. That is what makes it possible to have myself as an I. I cannot say I who perceives this object and I who perceives this heat, we are one and the same person, without also saying the object is objectively connected with the heat. The object is hot. And therefore, I who perceives both of them am the same person. Therefore, their perceptions must be connected. The empirical apperception, the subjective one, that is different for every other person. I already said you can associate things with one another. You can associate a certain song with a person or with a situation, or you can of course have wrong knowledge, like in many people's mind the concept of the Middle Ages will be connected with the concept of dirt, because they think that the Middle Ages were oh so dirty, while if you are more educated about this part of history, you will know that they weren't particularly dirty. So in your mind, then the Middle Ages will not be associated with the dirt. But the transcendental apperception as such is the same for any subject, for anyone who can say I at all, not even just for any human being. So if there are sentient aliens somewhere who also can think, then it's the same for them too. We must make objective connections between representations in order to be able to say that these various representations all belong to us. And therefore, in order to be able to say that there is an us. To say it in another way, each of us has his own empirical self. And therein lies our individuality. that our empirical apperception is always different. No two people have the exact same representations, connected, associated, aggregated with one another in the exact same ways. But then, if we abstract from everything that is individual, from our specific perceptions and emotions and desires and their specific connections with one another, and if instead we just reflect on what remains, that is self-consciousness in general, that is being an I, that is the I-ness, so to speak, then we can say that this I-ness is the same for everyone. This I-ness, this transcendental apperception, so connecting representations at all, no matter which specific representations and in which specific ways you may connect them, but making connections between them at all, that is necessary in order to even be an I. And if there are only a limited number of ways in which we can connect our representations, so if there's only a limited number of ways in which this transcendental apperception can happen, and indeed Kant will go on to say there are only 12 ways in which this can happen. I will talk about this soon in future lectures. Then that means there are only so many connections we can make objectively. And that is what leads Kant to saying there are 12 categories of thinking that we all share. But again, I will get into that in a future lecture. But despite all the empirical and material differences between the specific representations and their specific connections, the base ways of connecting are always the same, and therefore we all share the same 12 base elements, so to say, of our connecting, of our thoughts. And to say it in a third way, when we use the same word for something, like in this case the word I, there should be something that connects all the instances where we use the word. Like, for example, of course, empirical water is always different. There may be some water here in that glass, and then some water over there in that pond or in that ocean, some water falling from the sky as rain, some water will be more dirty, some water will be more pure. But in spite of these empirical differences, all water must share certain attributes, or else we wouldn't be justified in calling these various different things water. Giving the same name to different things denotes a certain sameness. So the waterness, what it means to be water, to be made up of hydrogen and oxygen and so on, that always remains the same. And the same can be said about the I. No matter how different all the I's are amongst various humans or even other thinking beings that might exist, what it means to be an I in general must be the same, or else we wouldn't be justified to all say I to ourselves. And what it means to be an I is that this original apperception is the same in all the I's. That all of them apperceive, that is, collect and connect all their various representations as belonging to one and the same I, to themselves. And they can only do so by making objective connections, by saying these two representations, they have to be connected because their connection lies in the object, and therefore they have to be in the same subject, because it is not possible that one subject would have perceived one of them and one the other, because they are objectively connected. If there are these two different kinds of apperception, that means we can also say that in a way we have two different eyes, two different selves. Of course, only formally speaking. Materially, they are one and the same eye. But formally, we can look at this one and the same eye from two different perspectives, so to say. On the one hand, there is the empirical eye of the empirical or psychological apperception, which Kant calls the Homo phaenomenon, the phenomenal man. That, once again, is what we mean when we talk about someone's personality or character. That, once again, is the person that empirical psychology deals with. Because that is the eye of the inner sense. So what I experience in myself, the emotions, the desires, the thoughts that I experience, that is I as I appear to myself, I as I am affected by myself. And then on the other hand, we have the eye of the transcendental apperception, which Kant calls the Homo noumenon, the noumenal man. This eye is the metaphysical eye, which is just a logical function. It is just a subject in every statement about an object. It is just the I in I am thinking this, I am representing this. And of course, we usually combine these two eyes, we usually think them together, but it is important here in philosophy to separate them. It is important to realize that this Homo noumenon is just this logical function, just this eternal subject, while on the other hand, the Homo phenomenon is an object. Not an object of the outer sense, like all other things, including our body, but rather the only and singular object of the inner sense, but still an object. The consciousness of this I, Kant says, is an intuitive consciousness of our passivity, while the consciousness of the other I, the Homo noumenon, is a discursive knowledge of our activity. So the one I is only receptive, and it is the other I, the I of the transcendental apperception, which is the truly spontaneous. And once again, spontaneity, self-activity is what thinking, what our intellectuality is all about, according to Kant. I can mention here that there is this famous paradox of the ship of Theseus, where you imagine a ship that gets repaired every year. So there's maybe one board that is broken and that gets replaced. And after many, many years, the people find that the ship has been repaired and the parts of it have been replaced so much that not a single plank, not a single nail of the original ship remains. And now the question is it still the same ship as it was originally? Now, whatever your answer to this paradox may be, this can also be applied to the eye. And I have heard people applying that to their eye and being quite distraught by that, saying that, the cells in our body, they constantly die off and they are replaced by new cells. And so when I'm an old person, I will have a completely different body with completely different cells than when I was a child. So how can I even be sure that I'm still the same person as I was back then, when not a single part of myself remains? Now, this is only a problem if you are dogmatic and materialistic in your thinking, and therefore need there to be something underlying the I, and therefore believe that identity is something that can only be perceived as existing, but that already is even before it is perceived, instead of something that is made. But in fact, identity is something that is made. You, in your thinking, make this connection. You, as an old person, will say, those experiences that I made as a child, those memories that I have of my childhood, they are my memories. And that will be the very reason why you will be the same person as this child whose memories you have. Everything else can change, but the I of the transcendental apperception, this I, this subject, has to remain the same. But we don't know anything about this I, except that it is this logical function of sort of collecting and putting together all of our representations as belonging to it, to this same I. Because, I mean, even the empirical I can change. Maybe throughout your life, you may change your whole character. Maybe you will disconnect yourself from the person you used to be. You will make different decisions, you will act differently, you will hold different opinions. Maybe you will judge your own past self and say that you were wrong in everything you did and believed. But even then, no matter how much your empirical I changed, this simple logical function of having an I will remain the same. As long as you say, this past person that I was, no matter how different I am now, but as long as you say, I was that past person, I don't believe in the things I used to believe anymore, but still the same person who back then believed those things and the same person who now believes other things, they are one and the same I. As long as you can say that, you indeed are the same I. You make the identity then. And this logical function of saying I think, these representations, they belong to me. They are necessarily connected in me. This can never change as long as you are. If you ever stopped saying I, you would stop existing. If some of your representations were connected as belonging to one subject, and some of your representations were connected as belonging to another subject, they would not both be your representations. some of them would then belong to you and some would belong to another person. This, by the way, is also why it makes little sense when some people believe that they will be reincarnated in another person. Like, how is that still you? In the way that those people believe in reincarnation. I'm not saying that we can completely rule out any sort of reincarnation, but in the way that it is often viewed, it makes little sense to say that is still you. Of course, people will claim it's the same soul that used to be in your body that goes into another body. Well, I don't know what this soul they speak of is supposed to be, but even if we assume that there is such a thing as this soul, okay, then this new person shares the same soul as you once had. But I mean, a new person could also share the same body or parts of the same body. I mean, when you die, your body will rot away, and the cells of your body, the atoms your body was made out of, they will probably become part of the ground, and out of the ground may grow new plants. The plants may be eaten by new humans. So eventually, the atoms of your body may end up forming another person's body in thousands of years. But no one would ever think of therefore claiming that this other person is the same person you used to be. And in the same way, I don't see how you are more justified to say that if instead of your material body or its atoms, your immaterial soul passes on to another, that other person is still you. No, you are still you as long as this transcendental apperception, this pure apperception, stays the same, and as long as you still say I to yourself. So if you want to believe in some sort of life after death, no matter what it may look like, you have to believe, Kant would say, that your transcendental apperception will remain, that you will still be able to say, I, who is now, am the same person who was before in this other life. Now, this difference Kant makes between the Homo phaenomenon, the empirical I, and the Homo noumenon is, of course, the same difference that he makes between the appearances, the phenomena, and the things in themselves, the noumena. And about this difference I already talked in my previous lecture on transcendental idealism. So we could also say that there is an I as it appears to us in the empirical apperception, and then through transcendental apperception we have the I in itself. And just like the thing in itself is unknowable, just like to us it is just an unknown X, as Kant says, so the I in itself is unknowable. Because if you think about it, just like you don't know what the objects are by themselves, independently of how they affect you, but you just know how they affect you and how you react to them, what representations they cause in you. Just like that, you only know yourself from how you appear to yourself. You know yourself through your emotions, through your desires, through your thoughts. So you only really know yourself by how you affect yourself inwardly. how your mind, your psyche affects itself. But you don't know how you are or what you are by yourself. You don't know, for example, no matter how much you look at your own emotions or how much you try to analyze your unconscious, through that you can never know if you have an immortal soul and if you will live on after you die, or if your I will perish as your body perishes. What you are in yourself, you cannot possibly know. All thinking, I said, is a connecting. And that is the activity of the I in itself. It thinks, it connects things. It connects various representations. But then what appears to you when it comes to your I is not the I in itself. It is only this connecting, this activity of connecting, or even just the results and products, the connections. And these appear to you in time. I talked about this in the previous lecture on sensuality. Kant says, like the form of the outer sense is space, and we can perceive things outside of us only in space, the form of the inner sense is time, and we can perceive our own emotions and thoughts and so on only in time. But time as such has no necessary relationship to connections. We connect, that is what our thinking does, and we, sensual, temporal beings that we are, we can only perceive the connections we form in time. But connections as such wouldn't necessarily have to be in time. It's just for us that they have to be. And that should show that you cannot know yourself as you are. You can only know as you appear to yourself in time. If you think about it, this I in itself, at least as far as we know, really is just a logical function. It is just self-consciousness as such, the ability to say I to yourself, the act of self-reflection, of reflecting about your representations and recognizing that they all belong to you as your representations. But apart from that, we know nothing about it. So if you think about it, the word I is really in a way the most empty and most meaningless word there is. Every other word has a certain content. When you say dog or tree or house, it means more than just object. It means a specific object with specific attributes. But when you say I, it doesn't mean a specific subject with specific attributes. At least when you say I in the sense of the transcendental apperception. Of course, when you talk about your specific self, then that has specific attributes. It has a specific personality, but those attributes you only know empirically. But when you just say I and nothing else, you are really just saying subject. You are saying thinker to the thoughts, viewer to the viewed things, and nothing else. It is an empty word. Fichte would later go on to call the I the subject objectivity, because it is both subject, the I in itself, the thinking, perceiving, and so on subject, and object, the empirical I, which is the object of this subject. And therefore Kant could have used the same name. He doesn't use that exact term, subject objectivity, but basically he's already saying the same thing, that the I is both subject and object at once. But the thing is, all that we can know is the object. We cannot know the subject. if we were to know it, it would become an object, and therefore we would only know what it can be as an object to us, but we would not know it as a subject. So let me give you an example from sensuality, from the physical. You cannot see yourself. Like, you can see your hand maybe, but you cannot see your own face, your own eyes. And if you now tell me I can see myself in a mirror, yes, that is true, but in the mirror, you are not truly seeing your actual body. You are seeing your image in the mirror. That is the object, so to say. But the subject, the seeing subject, can never see itself. You have to put yourself in front of yourself as an object, as an image, and then you have to see that. And of course, you could take a picture of yourself standing in front of the mirror and watching your own image in the mirror, and now you can look at that picture. But now the body you see standing in front of the mirror, once again, is not your actual body. It is just a photo of your actual body. And you can take a picture of yourself looking at the picture of yourself looking in the mirror, and this can go on and on and on. But I think it's quite clear that each time you just get an image. You can try to get an image of the previous subject that looked at the previous image, but then it again is just a new image. The actual subject you will never arrive at. And this leads me to another remark I want to make, and that is that the more unaufklärt a person is, the more he will probably think that he already has and knows his I. Just like unaufklärt people take the appearances to be the things in themselves and don't realize that they don't know the things in themselves. Just like that, they believe to already have their I. They believe that their I, their self, is the thing closest and best known to them. When in fact it's the opposite. It's the thing furthest and least known from them. People constantly talk about their I. My emotions, my identity, my experience, my wishes, my freedom. And they will make a big deal out of that. They will even do politics with that. They will demand that you take their emotions seriously, that you listen to them and their opinions and judgments, or they will demand their freedom, or whatever they take to be their freedom. But they don't realize that usually they have not really arrived at a true self yet. This self, this I they are talking about, is not really themselves. It is nature speaking through them, their natural desires, or it is society speaking through them, how they have been socialized, what they have been taught, the cliches they have been taught and they are now reproducing and living. But a true I is something they would only arrive at through work, through Aufklärung. I mean, it is a very old and very deep wisdom that the ancient Greeks wrote above the Temple of Delphi, this know thyself. If the I was always with me and always known to me, then it would be a very trivial, a very useless imperative. Nietzsche's whole philosophy can be put under the motto, become who you are. And Nietzsche knew what he was saying when he was saying that. He didn't say that because he assumed that people already are themselves, but rather because he very deeply understood that people are far from being themselves. I also want to make one other passing remark here, and that is that this insight of transcendental idealism, that I is basically an empty word, and that the I in itself is nothing, or at least something we don't know. That it is just a form, the form of subjectivity, a logical function, accompanying each of our judgments. This insight is also what in the last and the 20th century became the fundament of what is called existential philosophy, which was very prominent here on the continent. Be it people like Heidegger here in Germany, or be it existentialism in France with people like Sartre or Camus. This existential philosophy, I mean, in a narrower sense, it belongs to the 20th century. If you wanted, you could say that it has roots in the 19th century already, with someone like Kierkegaard. Or if you wanted to stretch it even further, you could say that the very first roots reach further to back to someone like Pascal. But it became really prominent and received its proper name in the 20th century. This existential philosophy is based on the realization that for us humans, existence, what Heidegger calls Dasein, being there, existence precedes essence. So for other things that might be different, like the essence of God, so what he is that he is almighty, all-knowing, holy, and so on. And that essence for us is there first. And now the question is, does he exist? Is there a being with such an essence, or is it just a thought that we have, but that doesn't have any reality? But for the human being, the existential philosophy says, it is the other way around. Our existence comes first. We, so to say, wake up one day and find ourselves in this world. Existential philosophy is very much based on this experience of what Heidegger called Geworfenheit, thrownness. So we find ourselves thrown into this world. We have been born without having asked to be born. And we have been born without knowing who we are or what our place is. And now we find ourselves thrown into this world, existing, and we know that we are, but not what we are. And maybe we try to give ourselves an essence, a being, a purpose, or maybe it is given to us by society, by ideologies, by philosophy, by religion. But at first, this I is empty and just thrown into the world. That is basically what this existential philosophy is based on. And insofar they are correct. They are based on a correct insight. However, I think it is still quite telling that the transcendental idealists, that Kant or Fichte or Hegel, they had the same basic insight that the I is empty, that it is a meaningless word, just a logical function, just something that exists but has no essence. But they didn't despair because of that. Existential philosophy, however, is very much about despair, about dread, about fear, about trembling, because to the existential philosophers, this inside of the emptiness of the I, of our existence preceding our essence, to them that is something terrible. It is like an abyss they gazed into. It is like this I is an empty hole, and they now suffer from the horror vacui, the horror of this empty space. So ultimately, you could say that the difference between these philosophies is not so much theoretical. They both agree on certain theoretical statements. It is practical. It is in how they react to that and how they deal with it. Because to Fichte, this was not this emptiness of the I was not something to be dreaded, but rather to be celebrated, because to him, this is exactly the basis for our freedom. If I already was something, then I would be bound to that something. I would be forced to be that something. I could only be what I already am. But since I am originally nothing, I am free to become something. I am free to turn myself into something. I am free to choose my own path. These later existential thinkers, however, they don't rejoice, they dread this. And I think this is ultimately a moral failure. Like always in such cases, there's a primacy of the practical over the theoretical. What a philosophy you make yours, Fichte says, depends on what kind of person you are. And I think ultimately with people like Heidegger, for example, I mean, in his case, it's very clear because, I mean, he supported the Nazis. He didn't have the same morality, the same integrity of character as someone like Fichte. And so ultimately, this existential philosophy is dreading the emptiness of the I, because these people are ultimately dreading freedom, because even if it's not conscious and they don't say it aloud, but they feel that freedom means responsibility. If I just was something because nature or God or whoever made me in that specific way and I can't be in any other way, then I would not be responsible for who I am. Then God would be to blame if, for example, I end up supporting the Nazis. But since I am free and can turn myself into this or that, I am responsible. And I think this is the true dread of the existential philosophers. And that is why their philosophy goes wrong, even though it is based on a true insight. And since I now already mentioned morality, I may also add that what I said here about the I in itself being unknowable, that is only partially true. It is only true from the perspective of theoretical philosophy. And of course, that is the perspective we are assuming right now, because I am for now talking about Kant's theoretical philosophy. But I already want to make clear that to practical philosophy, things are a bit different. Practical philosophy based on morality will be able to say something, to say a bit more about this I. And indeed, this difference between the Homo phaenomenon and the Homo noumenon will be central to Kant's moral philosophy, about which I will only talk in many, many weeks or months. Because, well, most moral theories are focused on the empirical man, the Homo phenomenon. We are told to, for example, have compassion and pity on the suffering of the empirical man. And And of course, you can have compassion with the empirical man, but you can also not have compassion with him. It can't really be demanded. It's not really an ought, a duty. And besides, there are maybe empirical people who you can't really have compassion with because they are just scum. Because, I mean, the empirical people, they are different. And therefore, if we were to judge the worth of a person empirically, we would have to say that some people are worth more than others. Some people are just better in various empirical ways. They act better, they contribute more to society, they are smarter, they are stronger, whatever. That is exactly why, as long as you try to base morality just on that, there is a very great and very real danger of this morality turning into immorality. Like it did with the Nazis or others who said, well, there are empirical differences, so some people are subhuman, so we will get rid of them. Kant will point out that morality is not really about the empirical human at all. It is about the human in itself. It is about humanity. So, what the moral law demands from us is that we have reverence not for the empirical man, who often can't be revealed because he often is a quite pathetic being, but we must have reverence for humanity. And we must have reverence for humanity in everyone. No matter how humanity may appear empirically in a specific person, still within him there is the very same humanity that is in all of us. This, of course, is a very old insight that many religious and mystical traditions had, that the differences between various humans are just empirical, but on a higher level, humanity in all of us is one and the same, and therefore hurting another person really means hurting myself, because I'm ultimately hurting humanity. But again, I will go more into that when I get to Kant's moral philosophy. I just wanted to clarify here already that everything I'm saying is only a half truth, because it is only true from the isolated perspective of theoretical philosophy. But I still must talk about the other perspective, that of practical philosophy, in the future. But anyways, to wrap this lecture up, what Kant is saying is that the transcendental apperception is the condition of the possibility of all experience. And that is really an analytic judgment. Now, transcendental apperception itself is synthetic. We bring unity into our thinking, or better to say, not we do, because we are this unity. We only come into being through this. Rather, thinking brings unity in itself by saying all of these thoughts, all of these representations belong to one and the same I. And that is a synthetic unity of the manifold. But stating that this synthesis is the condition of the possibility of experience, that is an analytic judgment. Because ultimately what it is saying is that all our representations, all our experiences must meet whatever the conditions are under which alone they can be our experiences. That is pretty self-evident, and again, that is merely analytical. in order that something can be my experience, it must meet whatever the criteria are for it being my experience, for it being a part of my consciousness, so for it being apperceived as being my experience. If there was a perception that my intellect could not, so to say, collect together with my other perceptions and subsume as being one of my perceptions, as belonging to me as a subject, well, then that perception would not be my perception. I would not perceive it as mine, and therefore it could not become part of my experience. To Kant, that is the core, or even all, of the difference between us and animals. To him, they may have representations, they may perceive things in a way, they may view things in a way, but they are not self-aware, meaning they don't form connections between these various representations, and they don't say I, they don't say those are my representations, and therefore they cannot make experience. Now, if this self, which is an act of thinking, which only comes into being through us apperceiving all our representations as ours, if that self in itself is a condition of experience, then now the question is, how exactly does this apperceiving work? What sort of connections do we form between our representations? And once again, I mentioned this earlier, if there is only a limited number of ways in which we in general can form these connections, then those ways would determine all of our experience. And not just ours, but once again, of all self-conscious beings, be they aliens or spirits, angels, demons, jinn, elves, fairies, whatever. If any such beings existed, that would be true for them as well. Just like different beings may walk very differently, like we have 2 legs, dogs have 4 legs, ants have 6 legs, someone may walk slower or faster, so different beings may think very differently, but still there is, so to say, a base structure that all walking shares. Like, all walking has to happen on the ground. If you are in the sky, you are not walking, you are flying. Just like that, all thinking would have to share certain base structures. Now, of course, this is only true for discursive intellect, or thinking faculty, because here I mean intellect in the broader sense again. This is only true for discursive intellect like ours. 2 lectures ago, in the lecture on how synthetic logical judgments a priori are possible, I said that according to Kant, we can think of God as having intellectual viewing. So an intellect that doesn't think, but rather views the things, because we can think of God as having an intellect, and intellect, thinking faculty, means the spontaneous, the self-active faculty, as having an intellect that produces not just form, but matter itself. So God doesn't just perceive things that are independently of him and that somehow affect him, and therefore perceives them not as they are, but as they affect him, as they appear to him, but rather God views the things, and by viewing them makes them, and therefore he views them as they really are, because they really are the way he views them. they really are in his intellect. And such an intellect that views, would not have to give the manifold material of the things a form which it otherwise doesn't have. But creatures such as we, who can only get the material, the content of their representations through sensuality, and whose intellect is discursive, whose intellect can really just reflect on this material which it itself hasn't produced, and whose intellect can really just give a form to this material. For such creatures, be they human beings, be they thinking aliens, for such creatures, the statement of transcendental philosophy is true, that all the forms we find in the world are really our forms. All the connections are the connections we made, and everything we could ever possibly experience must therefore be under these basic forms that we find in our intellect, because it can only be experienced by us in the forms we can give to it. And if we couldn't give it one of the forms we have to give, then we couldn't experience it. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Garnau Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Samet Özkilic, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklärung course.